Hi, everyone. My video today, I'm going to be covering the OpenAI Assistance API. So this is going to be a video on generative AI, and I'm going to be covering basically refactoring code and generating tests for that code using the Assistance API. Now, if you're not familiar with the OpenAI Assistance API, it's relatively new. It's still listed as beta, but there's a lot of really interesting use cases, and the API is actually pretty flexible and pretty powerful. Now, on the screen here, I have the developer quick start guide. This is just in their documentation, and it'll walk you through doing, Python node or just, curl request, HTTP request integration. And they'll show you just kind of, installing the library, setting your environment variables to add your API key, and then kind of sending a request, and basically just a really simple example, right? They do have some other documentation that talks about assistance, the overview, how they work, and I'll talk real quick about kind of what an assistant basically is, and then show a quick demo, and we can dive a little bit more into the capabilities. So an assistant, think of it as like a little mini application, and you're allowed to assign it a model with some type of prompt, right? Some type of kind of guidelines of, maybe it's like they kind of outline here its personality or capabilities. They can access multiple tools in parallel. So if you're not familiar with tools yet, think of tools, and sometimes they call it function calling. And you could kind of see that here on the screen, function calling. Basically, the tool is some kind of discrete unit of functionality that usually takes an input and produces an output, right? So it's a very, it can be a very simple function, and they have some examples of that we can show. But tools are a kind of an agent concept for generative AI. So again, if you're not familiar with an agent is kind of like a little program, right? It's got a very kind of specific task. It's got a number of tools available to it, and it can pick and choose which tools to use. Sometimes, the multiple tools in parallel scenario, it might use multiple tools, and it might take that result and kind of aggregate the data together and produce some type of output, right? So the tools that they have available right now is basically the code interpreter tool, which is what we'll be using. And they also have file search, which is pretty interesting. I could have used it here for code interpreter, and I'll talk about it, but I'm just not using that. And you can even build and host your own tools through this function calling. So there's a lot of flexibility here. Anthropic, which is kind of a competing AI provider, right, that makes the Claude model. They also have custom tool functionality as well in their API. You can kind of see these platforms evolving and providing more and more functionality in their platform besides simple inference or embeddings, right? One of the cool things here, this is kind of one of the powerful features of this, right, is assistants access persistent threads, right? So a thread is, just some type of conversation. It's a number of messages, and they're isolated to the thread. And the cool thing is they deal with all of that history for you. So they'll truncate the history. You can give it, different strategies for truncating. And they'll manage that so you're not overflowing the model's context length, which is pretty cool. You can append, messages to it, and it's got a nice little API. It's actually very simple. And the great thing is that when you start building applications with generative AI, it can be a simple inference, a one shot or few shot prompt, right? So you're giving it some information, and you just take the output, and away you go, right? Now, these more complicated, these React prompt type scenarios, and not React like the front end JavaScript framework, but React as in like the prompting technique, um, along with like chain of thought and other strategies, are essentially the future of AI, right? They're going to be basically what allows us to build applications with them, what allows us to break down complex tasks and perform reasoning about them. And it's a iterative process, more or less, right? So the idea here with the iterative process is you're kind of breaking things down sometimes, or you have a number of goals you need to accomplish, and You could have the AI do those things, but sometimes you have to kind of iteratively approach it just as, a normal human would, right? You would take a task, break the task down, do an output. Maybe you're writing code, you're refactoring it, you're, writing a test for it, whatever, whatever you're doing, right? But it's a stepped process. So the other cool thing is that there are, the concept of threads, and you can have assistants assigned to threads. So you can have a thread and basically assign an assistant to it. And you'll see here that they talk a little bit about the file API. And here's a really good example here, right? So they have this personal finance bot, retirement planning, and it's got this: how much should I contribute to my retirement plan? They're using this code interpreter tool, which is interesting, but maybe that makes sense because it's, some type of mathematical thing. And they've got this assistant here. This is the name of it, the thread that they created. And this effectively is being sent up to the API. They're creating the assistant or the thread. They're assigning it a tool. They're creating a message, and then a output comes out. It's actually really simple. So let's kind of look at some code examples. So I have a simple JavaScript, or it's basically just a node script here. I am using ESMs, right? So I've got kind of the top level of weight. And to run it, I'm just using TSX, which is fantastic for this type of stuff. So if you haven't used it, or you're still using TS Node for just running scripts locally, TSX is a pretty great alternative. And really here, I'll kind of just walk through this, right? I'm using the OpenAI SDK, so just following the getting started guide. And the first thing that, well, here, let me go back to my index file here, and let's just kind of walk through the code. So the first thing we do is we call this get or create assistant method. And what this method is it basically goes in and it tries to find an existing assistant by name. When you create an assistant, you'll have a unique identifier for it. I'm not storing it, so I just have this kind of simple list and check in here. If it can't find it, it'll create one. This is I'm not using every option available here, but you can see I call the create method on the OpenAI, sorry, object. I give it a name and a description. I can assign a model to it, and I can give it the system prompt, or like, the high level instructions, right? So mine is just kind of very simple in this case, and I'm basically just saying like, hey, look, you're going to be kind of in software engineering mode. You're going to be writing code, and then you need to return a JSON response in this format. And the format's pretty simple, right? It's not an array. It could be, but it's basically a description of what it did, and then the files that it worked on, file path, file contents. Very simple. So I'm not really too elaborate on the prompt. This is just kind of demonstration. Then they have the tools array here, and you could either do the function calling, as I mentioned, so you can have like custom tools, or you can use code interpreter or file search. File search is incredibly powerful. I'm using code interpreter here because I'm passing the file contents and a message. You could use file search here, and you could upload your code files that way too. There's so much you could really do with it. It's actually pretty incredible. So code interpreter is what I'm sticking with, right? So I get my assistant out, and now I call into create thread, and you'll see I pass it kind of what I was just talking about, right? A simple instruction. This is from like the user's context, right? Hey, refactor this file for me. And I'm just passing it as a string. Now, this file here is just in my local directory. I actually had GPT 3.5 generate this for me, and I asked it to generate some code that was not, thoroughly written, from the context of maybe a junior engineer, something that I could, there's room for improvement. And, it wrote this quick little script here, and, it's got a couple of functions, some example usage, and just a really simple JavaScript file. So anyways, I pass it in as a message to create thread. And what create thread is going to do is it's going to take in my string. It's going to start a new thread in the context, and it's going to put a message in there in the context of the user. So I can say user or assistant. I could inject messages in here if I wanted to. And I just pass it the string. Now, right now, the thread is separate from the assistant, right? There's no linkage between these things. So in order for me to have this assistant that I created go and process this file, what I have to do is, well, what I'm going to do is call this run and wait method. And you'll notice I pass it the thread ID. So it's the output of create thread, and the assistant ID, which was the output of my get or create assistant call. And I really just pass these in here, and I'm using their create and poll method. And create and poll is just a little bit of, kind of syntactic sugar around looking for a terminal state or a status. So the tools, let me see, I think they have a diagram in here. When you run it, it'll basically queue something up and it'll go through kind of various states. And you can, look at these and you can analyze them in the code. And there's a whole lot of really interesting things that are on here, not just the status. So like for instance, if you're using function calling, it can go into a required action state. So like it's waiting for a tool. It's actually a pretty well developed API. Let's go back to the code. So I create and poll, and basically it'll just wait. And when this, promise resolves, it'll move on to the next section here. It's just get thread messages. So this calls out to threads here, and it's just saying, hey, I've got a thread ID. Give me all the messages for it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this kind of interactively here. And then at this point, it's getting all of the messages back. And this will be the entire thread, right? So it's every single message that went into that thread. So it's my request, the assistant's response. And again, what's really powerful with the thread model here is it's that conversation history, right? So now what I can do, originally I said, hey, refactor this file, and it's going to send me a response back. So I'm just going to, I'll grab this code right here and I'll open my debug console, and this is its response here. So it comes back on this messages object, which has a data object, and then you've got an array of messages. And you'll see what I'm doing is I'm just picking out the first, I'm picking out one with assistant. In this case, it's a new thread, so there are no other messages other than its first response. I'm grabbing its content, and then its content here, you can see is this JSON object. So let's go through and try to just parse this real quick. And oops, I think I'm pretty sure that, let's see here, undefined. So we want text, and then we want value. Let's see, unexpected. Because it gave me it in Markdown here. So let's do this. Let's create a simple document. Let's drop this content in here. Let's see here. And you know what? I can just do it this way here. Messages. Let me grab the content. I'll grab the text, and we'll say copy value. We'll go paste this in here and remove the quotes. Let's see how this, I don't know what this is going to look like here, but we'll give it a shot. Anyway, so it gives me, just kind of separate this out. So it'll give me kind of its description saying like, here's a refactored version of the code. And it'll kind of explain to me, what it did, right? Making it more concise, whatever. It'll give me a file name, and then it'll give me the actual content of the file. So sorry, this is just kind of a blurb here, but you'll see that this is actually a comment. I was a little too aggressive on my new lines here, but it will basically take all of them and kind of and rewrite them, right? So you'll see here as an example, calculate total price. So if I come back in here, this was the the previous method, and then here's the new one. And what's nice too is you can see like it'll preserve the comment for it. And then obviously like, I could parse this out, write this to a file. But just as an example, right? This was just a very simple prompt, and it got the instruction to go do this, come back, and then, I just basically log this out to the console. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to add a response to the thread. And the response here is, can you write a unit test for this file? So, going into this add response, basically all I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, here's a thread ID, create a new message under that thread, and then here's the content for it under the role of the user. And this is the content, right? Just a simple sentence. So it's going to create it. Now it's going to call that same run and wait because it's got, a new message on the thread. So I can kick off the assistant on that thread, right? This is the same method we called up here. And it's going to run and wait for that terminal state. And when it sees that terminal state, it's going to take a second. It's going to return, right? So it's taking that chat history, right, and figuring out, based on its, strategy for managing that chat history, which is a normal problem in a chat application, right? For generative AI, right? Is it summarizing it? Is it just dropping the oldest messages? Things like that. So if I come in here, I'll go in and I'll get the thread messages again. And now my messages, there are 4 of them. And it's always the most recent message. So I can kind of just grab the first one and I'll log it here. And then effectively, I can come in here and I can see, here's a simple unit test. And I probably should have copied this. Let's see what this does. Yeah, so here's a simple unit test here, and it basically says the test covers these main functions, gives you the file name, and then it gives you the contents here. And let's just take kind of a quick peek at this without kind of formatting all the code. But you'll see it'll come in here, it'll write a function, print receipt, expect. I could have given it more instructions here. I could have given it, like test framework constraints or like, hey, can you cover this? Any kind of instruction here. And the point of this is not really the quality of the output. And sorry, this is kind of just blobs on the screen here. But basically, the idea here is that you can have this conversation, refine or break down, various pieces of information, break down tasks, and have it go and perform those tasks and in a very simple way. The API here is very simple. You're not managing that process, right? I've got a new message, you're not creating that chat structure, you're not managing the chat structure. Um, and this is so simple, right? It's just, hey, look, here's a tool, go and run the tool, give me the answer back. And kind of away you go. And if you had, let's say, the file search utility, right, and you were using some of the other tools here, what's really nice with file search is you could actually chunk and create vector stores and embeddings on the documents too, right? So if you wanted to search a PDF or whatever, or ask questions about the code, you can do that very simply. Now that might get you kind of mixed results. It's a tough subject, but in other words, you can create these vector stores, and I believe you can create them and assign them to a thread, which is also really cool too. So they'll talk about how file search works and how it optimizes your query, and you can go and you can search them, and it talks about chunking and how you can configure it. One of the limitations here on file search is they don't have pre-search filtering, which can be hard, right? If you wanted to reduce your data set and not just fall back to the vector search. So that can be a problem. So in other words, the problem is if you have, let's say, 100 documents and your documents are split 50-50 between, let's say, 2 different categories, and you're only retrieving 10 vector results, you might get things from both categories, and you might have wanted just one category to start in, right? So that's kind of the pre-search filtering. And then there's, some other limitations here. But the vector store, again, is really cool. And this, again, is just something built into it. So you can literally just call this simple API and they'll pretty much manage the whole thing for you. And you don't have to worry about, the separate pieces and, having a separate vector store and maintaining that if it's a very simple application, right? And the other cool thing too is that, again, a lot of it's configurable, It's a thread, so you're able to go and put this information in and then run different assistants, right? So you could have an assistant with kind of one goal in mind and have an assistant with another goal in mind, and you can have them kind of both work on the files together and get the information that you want out of there. Just using, again, a very simple API. The other really cool thing to point out here is I want to say, is it on the thread or is it on the message? I want to say that, yeah. So they also have the ability to take a thread, and when you run it, you can override part of the system template or provide like a supplemental system template on top of it. And that's a really cool thing because if your assistant has a really kind of generic, kind of base set of functionality, you can go and enrich the whole thread, and you don't necessarily have to go and add it as a message, right? You don't have to have a user message with like all the different instructions and then your actual message. You can just kind of enrich the functionality in the thread, which will kind of pass it to the assistant. So there's just a whole lot of functionality here with it, and it's one of the APIs for OpenAI that I think makes this viable to go and build an application off of. And it's not going to be an overly complex application, but you can build some pretty fancy logic between assistants and threading and sharing threads between assistants. There's really a lot there. And again, it's iterative, right? It's here's information, here's an instruction, and then it's refining or doing something with that output. And again, that's, I think, the direction of AI, right? That is essentially how you would make a complex task, right? Generative UI, all these things are going to be complex tasks, refining things, right? Creating things, refining it, adding it to it, checking the quality of an output, things like that. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. Definitely give the OpenAI API a chance in the assistance beta. There's a whole lot of assistants that are already created out there, but if you're looking to create something very simple with it, you can definitely do that with just a couple lines of code, or even just HTTP requests. You don't need to have a full program. So again, there's a lot you can do, but hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.